to Pennsylvania Crossfire. I'm Buddy Lesevoy, local attorney, and I'll be your moderator today. Pennsylvania Crossfire is brought to you by this station and our sponsors to air important issues of the day. Today, we're delighted to have back with us three doctors from the Philadelphia area. I'd like to introduce each of them to you. On the left is Dr. Stephen Hunt. He's an MD with a PhD, has scholarly interests in optimized drug delivery for cancer patients. He enjoys conspiracy theories, believes data and democracy can solve any problem, and although he refuses to align himself with any ideology, Dr. Jha, who's sitting next to me, believes he's a secret admirer of the Austrian School of Economics, but he refuses to admit it. On the right, we've got Dr. Paulo Nucifara. He's also an MD with a PhD. He has scholarly interests in post-traumatic stress disorder, is an unabashed Keynesian, noting that there are very few people who actually understand Keynesian economics. He believes that Ronald Reagan was a closet Keynesian and thinks science can solve anything. And last but not least, next to me is Dr. Harry Jha. He's an MD with an MS degree. He has scholarly interests in value of information. He's a tireless contrarian, as I'm sure will come out today. He believes that we need to temper our belief in data with judgment and common sense. He also asserts that Hayek's The Use of Knowledge in Society should be required reading. Today, we want to discuss the hot topic of Ebola. I think it's fair to say that all of us have concerns about it. The challenge seems to be trying to balance out the risk of complete hysterics over the contagious elements of it with reality, and I'm not so sure any one of us truly trusts anything that we're hearing. Dr. Jha, let me start with you. I mean, if you were a doctor who volunteered and treated patients in the infected areas of Africa, and you came back to this country, would you go bowling with your friends?
Buddy, firstly, thank you for inviting us on the show. And secondly, I do know who you're alluding to. You're alluding to Craig Spencer from New York. I would say Craig is my hero, largely because I think when I was a medical student, I watched Outbreak, with Dustin Hoffman. I think it was Dustin Hoffman. And that monkey who became airborne, or rather the Ebola became airborne. And it was just also, exciting, like the James Bond of medicine. I don't go bowling, particularly after a long vacation somewhere or a long break somewhere. But I think the guy's a hero. I wouldn't have gone anywhere near the public. He's a hero. So here's the thing. The media seem not to be able to synthesize 2 points together. The guy is an absolute hero, but perhaps he might not have been the wisest for exposing himself in a city like New York to the subway and to bowling. And here is the basic tension. The tension is this. People want to know with Ebola what exactly are the risks. When you say risks, you have Ludo, you're playing dice, and you say, what are my chances of getting 2 6s and a 5? With a little bit of effort, I can probably give you that chance. You can't do that with Ebola because we don't know. I mean, we kind of know, but we don't really know. There's a level of uncertainty. And that level of uncertainty is something you have to appreciate. It's the reason why when I go hiking with my kids to Delaware Water Gap, I don't put my hand in the hole. I don't know for sure there's a rattlesnake there, but if there is, if I'm wrong, I'll get bitten and I'll possibly end up having renal failure or die. Because the error of not knowing is more severe in one direction than the other. And so I think Craig Spencer is an absolute hero. I admire him. I don't think I could emulate him, but I wouldn't have done what he did.
Well, any thoughts, Dr. Nucifara?
I agree. I mean, I think that one of the main issues surrounding Ebola is our lack of knowledge regarding how it's transmitted and what is the risk, particularly because there aren't that many cases here. But I don't think it's unreasonable to be prudent on the side of caution if you just came back from an exposed area. Any disagreement?
No, I mean, I think, again, as Harry drilled in, the man volunteered, went over there, but what we need really the general public to be behind that effort, because if the disease progresses out of control elsewhere in the world, the way that the international travel is happening today, we will end up with it back here. We've already shown that with the case who came over here spontaneously. He had family here in the United States. He came over, the gentleman in Texas I'm referring to. And so really, to me, the physicians who are giving up their time and their lives to go over there and treat these folks, what we need that effort to be sustained and going forward. And so what that means is we need the general public to feel comfortable that when they're putting their lives at risk, that they feel comfortable that that is not importing the risk back to the United States. And so for that reason, I think that he should have stayed in, or we shouldn't have heard about it one way or the other, you know, because essentially what we're talking about is even if the risk is almost negligible in the absence of symptoms that he could be spreading the disease, the truth is that folks don't know exactly what that is, and we've already seen that people who we thought were negative, and they thought themselves were negative, including that doctor, ended up having the virus. And so what that means is, out of an abundance of caution, and to me, mostly because of the fact that we want to sustain this effort, and we want more folks to be willing to step forward and be willing to go over there and help contain the disease so it doesn't end up flooding our borders, we need to have a very good plan in place. And what that means is that I think the Obama administration and the CDC were behind the 8 ball in the sense that when we started sending folks over there, we should have already had a plan of what happens when they return. You see, where was the plan of what happens when we return? You know, you didn't see that in the bulletin briefs. And so instead it's left up to the states to try to figure out what to do with these folks.
So speaking of which, then, how do you feel about the governors in New Jersey and New York imposing, you know, presumed mandatory isolation quarantines?
I think that the governor is essentially chief executive of the state. And what he has to do is he's considering the risk. Now, while I feel that the risk is probably closer to what the head of the CDC, who has much more knowledge of the subject, and what the scientists are saying, I disagree with, you know, the New England Journal of Medicine article that just came out. The opinion article is very critical of the governor, because I think the governor is trying to think in real time, how do I protect the people of my state, okay, against this disease, but also against the backlash and the hysteria against the disease. Okay, what you don't want is that the people to say, we're not allowing any of our healthcare physicians to leave the state and go over there and be able to come back. You don't want that to happen. And so you have to therefore have a plan of what happens to the folks when they get back, that you can assure the general public that they're not going to be importing the disease back here to the United States.
Your thoughts?
I'm in rare agreement with Dr. Hunt. Yeah.
So much for the contrarian.
I know. It's amazing. One of the most important books I think anyone should read is George Bush's Decision Points. He explains why he made the decisions with regards to Iraq, with regards to 9/11, and one may not agree with it. I certainly don't. One can agree that what he's trying to think about. And here, it's easy for medical scientists, physicians, and say, look at the evidence. Whereas the governor is thinking, so what if I'm wrong? What if I mess this up? What if the science, and he's got good evidence there. Science changes its mind about lots of things. So it's not as if he's making it up. What if science changes its mind 2 weeks from now? What if the CDC reviews their guidelines? What if I've just exposed New Jersey, New York to somebody that I could have prevented? So I as an armchair commentator cannot be Kumo or a Christie. And to judge him, one has to be him, and which I'm not.
Dr. Nusafar?
I agree, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that, you know, there's risks to action as well as risks to inaction. So we're talking about the risks of letting someone back into the country and potentially infect other Americans. But there's also a risk if you start applying sufficiently stringent quarantine.
On that note, let's take a break so we can hear from our sponsors that make this show possible. Please stay tuned. We're coming right back. Welcome back to Pennsylvania Crossfire. Today we're discussing Ebola with 3 doctors from the Philadelphia area, and heading into the break we cut off Dr. Nusafar on the issue of whether you support or challenge the governor's actions in New York and New Jersey about imposing quarantines.
I mean, I don't know if I would challenge it, but there's certainly things to keep in mind. Right now we don't have a vaccine for Ebola, so our best hope of containing it actually is to contain it at its source in West Africa. And the country that is best equipped to do that is the United States. So to the extent that we are limiting the ability of people to go over there and come back, or discouraging people from going there and coming back to treat patients in Africa, we are sort of making problems worse. I mean, we talk about what is the risk of someone returning from an exposed region and infecting people here, but you can also think of it this way. What's the risk that we send fewer people there and the disease therefore progresses faster and therefore will get here faster?
Well, let's stick with you because I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the science associated with Ebola and the risks in particular of transmission. Of what we know, how much is real?
Well, I mean, what we believe is that the risks of transmission are, as you probably know, just through bodily fluids. It's not yet considered to be transmissible through airborne means. And what that means is that the rate at which it'll grow in a population is much slower than a lot of other diseases. For instance, measles and so forth grow very quickly through a population exponentially. In contrast, Ebola will take longer. Of course, there's always the possibility that Ebola will mutate or change. But for now, on a scale of all pathogens, the rate at which the epidemic is expected to grow is on sort of the low side.
Do you concur?
It is on the lower side, but the other thing I would caution is with the initial CDC reports that were put out there, I sort of equated it with your risk of getting HIV or some of these other viruses that people have a visceral feel for. And the reality is that with HIV, if you touched someone's blood with HIV, you'd be very unlikely to get HIV. Whereas with this, the viral particles are such higher numbers in the bloodstream of folks who are infected that your chance of getting infected is much, much higher if you're exposed to their bodily fluid at a specific state of disease where they're shedding a lot of the virus, okay? And the truth is that the CDC is putting out these guidelines based on science that is real in the sense of they can quote numbers of transmission and who's more at risk of getting the virus in terms of when they study these communities in Africa, okay? But they made all these proclamations, and then what happened did not fit up to the reality. In other words, healthcare workers who are in an environment which they're trying to isolate the patients ended up contracting the virus. And so that makes it look like the science itself is questionable, which it's not. It's a matter of how you apply what we know about the virus in the real world. Because an isolated situation like they can have down at the CDC or in Atlanta at Emory University, where they have this very specific unit of folks who are very well trained and have gone through a lot of the procedures, they have all these fail-safe procedures of how it's going to happen. So for example, in our hospital and up at MGH, they've made a set of guidelines that say a person who's in the hospital with Ebola cannot go to get a CAT scan or go somewhere else in the hospital for a laboratory because it's going to expose too much risk and they don't know how to contain it. And so instead, for example, what they've done for that patient, those nurses, is they hand an X-ray sheet which enclosed in some plastic, and basically everything is done in such a way that everything has to be done in that room. So no surgeries can happen unless they can happen in that room. No procedures can happen unless they can happen in that room with everyone in their bunny suit, okay? So because they have standard operating procedures with fail-safe mechanism, just like in the airline industry, where if you have one fail-safe that falls through, you have another one to catch you. That's what we need. And so that's the kind of thing that I think the science tells us, that you have very high viral particle load in these folks as they get very sick. And indeed, you can catch it just by exposure to the bodily fluid. And that's what we need to keep in mind. If, on the other hand, folks will not catch it from just coughing. It's not an airborne thing.
So are you satisfied? Do all physicians have a handle on the realities of the science?
I don't think they do. Largely because I don't think a lot of people understand three things about science. Firstly, science, at least those that actually do real science, the physicists who study the origins of the universe, they'll say the first thing is science is not certain. Science is not supposed to be certain. Science always has an element of uncertainty, which is how science grows. The second problem here is that how is this science being applied? The science is being applied by using a numerator and a denominator. The numerator being the number of cases that are infecting, and the denominator is the number of people exposed. And unless you actually have lots and lots and lots and lots of people, those numbers are prone to error. And again, the question here is what happens with the error? So there's an error. Okay, so you overcall this person with Ebola. She's really annoyed. Actually, she's not hypothetical, she's real. She's a nurse in Maine. She's really annoyed. She's just thrown a middle finger at the government and gone cycling, violating quarantine. All right, it's a bit embarrassing. But what if you're wrong the other way? What if you think it's fine, but it's not? Here's a virus that's multiplying. Here's a virus that's suddenly gone airborne. So the point here is that error is not 50-50. Error is very asymmetric. So I don't think science can necessarily deliver us from this. And science doesn't necessarily say, I can deliver you from this, because science encompasses uncertainty. It's the fundamental nature of science.
Well, you bring up the nurse, but do you think she was treated unfairly, either in New Jersey or now in New England?
You know, I think fair is the most popular four-letter word in the English language.
Well, it's the only one you can actually say on TV. So.
And it really does amaze me, because about almost 100 years ago, this guy Shackleton went to Antarctica, and he advertised saying, long journey, brave men needed, or brave women needed, chance of returning improbable, and chance of death high. And then he received thousands of adverts for that. The reality is, people that go here, they're not like people like me, Dr. Hunt, and Dr. Nichifora. They're brave men.
And women.
And women. Thanks. They are brave men and women. And to think that they're going to be perturbed by being quarantined, I think it's an insult to them, to be quite honest. What's actually happened is that you've got somebody coming back who has been sort of taken by this media that really, you know, it's like Midas or reverse Midas. It kind of, you know, destroys everything that it touches. Noting that I'm on media at the moment. And it just makes zeros out of heroes. Obviously the nurse was in a way treated unfairly, but the nurse went to Ebola-stricken land, was brave, was very brave. This never should have been an issue.
Yeah, but you know, look, as a layperson, I am quick to recognize the heroics of all of our professionals that respond to pathetic, sad, gut-wrenching situations like that. But how do you not feel that there's an element of recklessness when the science is only as certain as we think it may be in the moment, and the risks are so potentially high for exponential contamination? I mean, each person is seeing and touching 70 people who then see and touch 70 people who see, and in a moment's notice, we're talking thousands potentially.
And what you're talking about really, and what Harry was getting at, was this notion of tail events. When we study things in science, we're often looking at means, okay? And so you have a nice big curve, and you look at what's happening at the peak. And what we're talking about is events down at this tail that's way over here, out of sight, okay? And that's where I think that out of the abundance of caution, even if it doesn't mean that the numbers really, I think, are on the side of the CDC. The chance of you getting it in the United States, the chance of you dying of the flu this year are thousands and thousands and thousands and probably millions of times more than a chance of dying of Ebola in this country, okay? But the reality is that even given that case, we need to have the general public on board with our treatment plan, which means we have to have a plan for these folks coming back.
Agreed. Let's take a break, though, so we can hear from our sponsors that make the show possible. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Pennsylvania Crossfire. Today we're discussing the Ebola virus. We have with us three physicians from the Philadelphia area. We went into the break on the issue of quarantines and whether fundamentally or even specifically it's unfair to treat patients that have been exposed to the virus with a forced quarantine. Dr. Nichifora, your thoughts?
I just wanted to add something to what Harry and Steve were discussing earlier, and that's sort of a discussion of risk and uncertainty and how it relates to science and medicine. And I wanted to just draw the distinction between the two. I mean, our science of Ebola tells us certain things with a certain amount of uncertainty attached to it, which I think was what Harry was discussing. But when it gets into the medical field, that uncertainty is sort of amplified. In other words, there's a certain conservatism in medicine that's baked in to everything that we do. If science tells us something is probable or unlikely, when it gets into medical practice, those unlikely events are treated as much more likely than they really are. And so everything is being done with even more caution than maybe the science itself would warrant. And I think, it's important when we're looking at the CDC response is that it's important to consider that that's already being addressed. In other words, they're not just looking at the possibility that of infection, they're looking at even the very unlikely possibilities of infection, trying to address those at the same time. It's a much more conservative approach than you might expect just from a read of the facts.
So I'm a relatively conservative guy. What about those that think we should ban any and all flights into areas known to be infected?
Well, to my knowledge, there's not any direct flights from the United States to Liberia, but I don't think that banning flights is going to be helpful precisely for the reasons that Harry dictated earlier, which is that we need to have more of our folks on the ground who understand how to treat this disease and understand how to put out the fire at its source. And if we're restricting that, or if we're leading to economic collapse of those countries such that the diseases can have an opportunity to spread even more because of the lack of public health and all the other required infrastructure for keeping the disease at bay, then I think we're only going to end up shooting ourselves in the foot. Your thoughts?
I agree with Dr. Hunt. It's getting really nervous now.
Now you're making us all nervous, frankly. So.
I think it was Leon Trotsky that once said that you might not be interested in the Communist Party, but the Communist Party is interested in you. I just want to paraphrase that. Americans might not be interested in the rest of the world, but the rest of the world is interested in America. So as much as, and I absolutely admire that fact that this is the country that steps to the plate. And this is the country that will solve Ebola. This is the country that will quench Ebola where it is most festering, because it has the means to do so. It has not only the money to do so and the resources to do so, but the intellect and the coordination to do so. So absolutely, you have to have a full-fledged American effort in Western Africa. And for no other reason than the fact that no American is going to be safe unless that's quenched. So the question, I would say, isn't should flights be banned. Flights may eventually be banned if there are 20 cases of Ebola in this country. The question I think all policymakers should be asking, and all the central government and even the state government should be asking, is if they are banned, if, for example, the United decides not to accept any flights, if the government decides not to accept any visas, how are we going to get medical expertise into these areas? And that really is the only question that we should be focused on.
Dr. Nucifora?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Harry was saying before. Just as the physicians showed bravery in individually treating cases in Liberia, it's sort of upon us as a nation, as pretty much the ones who are going to be the leaders in addressing this, to show some bravery in the way we deal with the other countries.
So what do you think it tells us about our country?
I actually think it shows that, in response to uncertainty and potential loss of life, we can actually come together. We can make rational decisions. We see a lot of anxiety and so forth expressed in the media, but overall, I think that our response has been pretty good. We haven't really been carried away with too many exaggerated responses. It's been pretty rational and thought out overall. I mean, there's always improvement. We should have thought out better about how to deal with patients or physicians who are returning from West Africa. But overall, I think it shows a good response.
I think we have a very long history in this country of going and dealing with these infectious outbreaks at their source. You think back to the yellow fever and malarial outbreaks in the Caribbean in the early part of the century. What we learned from our health corps, from dealing with the yellow fever in Cuba and in Dominican Republic, et cetera, that was used later, a few decades later, in responding to the big outlay of polio vaccination in trying to deal with how do we vaccinate our public against diseases that were back here at home and prevalent still at the time. And so I think that we are going to grow from this experience. I think that the peak of the Ebola is going to continue to rise. We are not over the hurdle yet of it. We do not have this disease contained. More than 4,000 folks have died from this disease, mostly back there in Africa. And we are going to see more cases abroad. They get shipped abroad because of the international nature of travel. Okay, the disease is only going to get worse from here, but we can learn something from this, and America is primed to respond.
Last minute.
Buddy, I have boundless admiration for America. I'm not an American. I'm a recent immigrant. But I do think that this whole episode has brought about, it's unveiled an ugly polarization of the country. I always knew that America is polarized ideologically. You know, you have the conservatives, you have the progressives, small government, big government. But why is it that the progressives are the ones that believe that there is no science to the danger of Ebola, and the conservatives aren't the ones? It's as if there's an ideological compartmentalization as well. And I don't think that this is healthy. You have one segment, one group that's essentially preaching to themselves, and the other group that's preaching to themselves. And there is, it's dangerous when science gets polarized, and I think that's the danger here.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but it does prove one point: we're very political in this country. I want to take this opportunity to thank our doctors, Doctors Hunt, Nusafora, and Jha, and especially thank our viewers at home for watching. Please be sure to tune in next week for another great edition of Pennsylvania Crossfire. This is Buddy Lesevoy for Pennsylvania Crossfire, hoping you have a great week.